"You'll have to pay 3,700 rees to sleep here," my daughter-in-law said in front of the whole family after I became a widow and lost my home. Everyone stayed silent, waiting for me to humiliate myself. But that's when I announced something that shut everyone up. "You'll have to pay $3,700 a month to sleep here," my daughter-in-law said, her fork cutting through the roast beef with surgical precision. The dining room went silent. Even the grandfather clock in the hallway seemed to pause mid-tick. My son David stared at his plate like he was trying to memorize the floral pattern on the china. Aunt Margaret, who'd driven 40 minutes to join us for what I thought was a family dinner, suddenly found her water glass fascinating. The neighbors, Tom and Linda from next door, shifted uncomfortably in their chairs. I felt my chest tighten, that familiar squeeze that had been visiting me more often since Harold passed. 3 months ago, $3,700. The number hung in the air like smoke, choking out any warmth that had existed moments before. "Mom," David finally whispered, still not looking up. "Maybe we should discuss this privately." "No," the word came out, sharper than I intended. I set down my fork and looked directly at Sarah, my daughter-in-law of 12 years. Her blonde hair was pulled back in that severe bun she wore when she meant business, the same style she'd adopted when she convinced David to buy this house that was clearly beyond their means. I think everyone heard the offer clearly enough. Sarah's blue eyes met mine without flinching. She'd always been direct, I'd give her that. When she first started dating David, I'd actually admired her straightforward nature. Now, sitting at her perfectly set table with her perfectly coordinated place settings, I wondered when directness had morphed into cruelty. "It's just practical, Eleanor." She used my full name like a weapon. "You need a place to stay? We have a guest room, and we have expenses. It's a business arrangement." Business arrangement. As if I hadn't spent 68 years learning the difference between business and family. As if I hadn't spent the last 35 years treating her like the daughter I never had, even when she made it clear that sentiment wasn't reciprocated. I reached for my water glass, buying time to steady my voice. The crystal caught, the light from the chandelier Sarah had insisted on installing last year, casting tiny rainbows across the white tablecloth. Rainbows at a funeral would have been more appropriate. "And if I can't pay?" I asked. The silence stretched again. Tom cleared his throat and started to rise. "Maybe we should go." "Sit down, Tom." I didn't raise my voice, but something in my tone made him sink back into his chair. "I want everyone to hear this conversation. Seems like it's the kind of talk that needs witnesses." Sarah's jaw tightened. She hated being challenged publicly, especially by me. "You'll figure it out, I'm sure. You've always been resourceful." Resourceful. Another weapon word. Code for, you're tough enough to handle whatever we throw at you, so don't expect sympathy. I looked around the table at these people I'd known for years. Margaret, Harold's sister, who'd been coming to family dinners since before David was born. Tom and Linda, who'd borrowed our lawnmower every summer for 15 years and brought us tomatoes from their garden every fall. David, my only child, who used to call me every Sunday without fail until about 2 years ago when the calls became sporadic, then monthly, then only when he needed something. And Sarah, who'd somehow managed to orchestrate this moment with the precision of a military campaign. The timing wasn't accidental. 3 months after Harold's funeral, 2 weeks after I'd mentioned that keeping up with the mortgage was getting difficult, one day after David had helped me start going through boxes in the garage, she'd been planning this. "I accept," I said. The words surprised everyone, including myself. David's head snapped up so fast I worried about his neck. Sarah's fork actually paused halfway to her mouth. "What?" David stammered. "I said I accept. $3,700 a month for the guest room, but I have conditions too." Now Sarah set down her fork entirely. This wasn't going according to her script. What conditions? I smiled, feeling something shift inside my chest. Not the tight squeeze of anxiety, but something else. Something I hadn't felt since before Harold got sick. Something that reminded me of the woman who'd built a small catering business from nothing but determination and a few family recipes back in the 80s. First, I pay month to month. No long-term lease, no deposit. If either of us wants to change the arrangement, 30 days notice. I counted on my fingers as I talked, a habit Harold used to tease me about during business negotiations. Second, I have full use of the kitchen between 6 and 8 a.m. every morning, no exceptions. The kitchen? Sarah's voice pitched higher. What do you need the kitchen for? That's my business. Third, I want a key to the house and permission to have guests visit during reasonable hours. Guests? Now David was the one with the higher pitch. Friends. Maybe some of the ladies from church, maybe some new friends I haven't met yet. I kept my voice steady, professional. This was feeling more familiar by the minute. And fourth, no interference with my activities as long as they don't disturb the household or break any laws. Sarah and David exchanged a look that told me everything I needed to know about how decisions got made in this house. She was clearly the one running the show. Fine, Sarah said finally, but the first month's payment is due before you move. And agreed, I can write you a check tonight. Another silence. This one felt different though. Less suffocating, more electric. Margaret finally spoke up. Eleanor, honey, are you sure about this? I turned to look at her. This woman who'd been family to me for 40 years, who'd held my hand at Harold's bedside, who'd helped me clean out his closet when I couldn't bear to do it alone. I'm sure, Margaret. Sometimes you have to make the best of an unexpected situation. Tom was shaking his head slowly. $3,700 seems like a lot for... For what, Tom? I asked gently. He looked around the table, clearly uncomfortable. For family. The word hit like a physical blow, but I didn't let it show. You're right. It does seem like a lot, but then again, maybe that's the point. I stood up, my legs steadier than I'd expected. Sarah, I'll have that check for you before I leave tonight. David, I'll need help moving my things this weekend. Margaret, would you mind driving me back to the house? I have some packing to do. As I walked toward the hallway to get my purse, I heard Sarah whisper urgently to David, but I couldn't make out the words. Didn't matter. I had a feeling I'd be learning a lot more about what got whispered in this house over the coming months. This first week in the guest room was like living in a museum. Everything was beige and cream, carefully coordinated and completely sterile. The bed was comfortable enough, queen-sized with a firm mattress that didn't aggravate my arthritis. But the room felt like a hotel, down to the generic landscape prints, on the walls and the basket of travel-sized toiletries Sarah had placed on the dresser. I established my routine quickly. Up at 5:30, coffee made and drunk before anyone else stirred. 6 o'clock sharp, I was in the kitchen, using my allocated 2 hours to prepare what Sarah assumed was just my breakfast. She never asked, and I didn't volunteer information. Those are my first mornings. I baked. Simple things at first. Banana bread, using bananas that were getting too ripe in Sarah's pristinely organized fruit bowl. Chocolate chip cookies, the recipe my mother had taught me when I was 12 years old. The smell filled the house, and I watched through the kitchen window as David's nose would twitch when he came downstairs for his coffee. "Smells good in here," he said on the third morning, hovering in the doorway like he was afraid to commit to a full entry. "Help yourself," I said, nodding toward the cooling rack. "I made extra." He took a cookie and bit into it, and for just a moment, I saw my little boy again. The kid who used to stand on a chair next to me in our old kitchen. More flour on his face than in the bowl. "These taste just like," he started, then stopped. "Like The ones I used to make when you were 10 and had that growth spurt? When you'd eat a dozen after school and still want dinner? He smiled, a real smile that reached his eyes. I was going to say, they taste like home. That might have been the moment I started to hope that maybe this arrangement, however it had come about, might give us a chance to find each other again. But then Sarah appeared in the doorway, wrapped in her silk robe, her hair still perfect despite having just woken up. "What's all this?" She gestured at the cooling racks, the mixing bowls I was washing in the sink. "Cookies," David said, taking another one. "David, you know you're trying to watch your cholesterol." She moved to the counter and started putting the cookies into a container. "Eleanor, I thought we agreed the kitchen time was for your breakfast." "I'm not stopping you from using the kitchen," I said mildly, "and technically, some of these will be my breakfast." She gave me a look that suggested she thought I was being deliberately obtuse. "It's just that I have a system. I meal prep on Sundays and I don't really want extra food around to tempt David." Extra food, as if love baked into sugar and flour, was somehow an inconvenience. "Of course," I said, drying my hands on the dish towel. "I'll be more mindful of that." But I wasn't. The next morning, I made blueberry muffins. The morning after that, cinnamon rolls. Not because I was trying to cause problems, but because baking was what I did when I needed to think. And I had a lot to think about. Like why Sarah always seemed to be checking her phone during dinner, typing quick messages with a frown on her face. Like why David had started coming home later from work, sometimes not until after 8 o'clock. Like why there were unopened bills stacked in the drawer next to the refrigerator, bills I'd glimpsed when Sarah asked me to grab a pen. Like why a house that should have been filled with warmth felt so cold. I started taking walks after breakfast. Once my kitchen time was up and before Sarah fully started her day, the neighborhood was older, established, with tree-lined streets and houses that had personality. Not like the cookie-cutter subdivision where Harold and I had lived for 30 years, but not fancy either. Comfortable. The kind of place where people knew each other's names and borrowed cups of sugar. Mrs. Patterson, who lived in the blue house with the rose garden, was usually outside watering her flowers by 7:30. She waved the first few mornings, and by the end of the week, we were chatting over the fence. "You're staying with the Hendersons," she said. It wasn't a question. "I'm David's mother." I didn't elaborate. She nodded knowingly. "Sweet boy, always." Was polite when they first moved in. "Haven't seen him much lately, though." "He works hard." She adjusted the nozzle on her hose, creating a fine mist over her prize-winning dahlias. "That wife of his, She paused, choosing her words carefully. "She's very particular about things." I waited. Sometimes the most important information comes in the spaces between words. Had the whole street up in arms about the Johnsons' fence last year, said it was 6 inches onto their property, cost the Johnsons $1,500 to have it, surveyed and moved. Was it on their property? Mrs. Patterson snorted. 2 inches. 2 inches, and it had been there for 12 years. I filed that information away. Someone who'd go to war over 2 inches of fence was someone who paid very close attention to boundaries, and someone who kept very careful track of what belonged to whom. She works, doesn't she? Sarah? Oh yes, some big corporate job downtown. Marketing, I think? Always leaving early in the morning in those expensive suits. Mrs. Patterson's tone suggested she had opinions about expensive suits. Though lately, she's been working from home more. Sees her car in the driveway most afternoons. Interesting. Sarah had mentioned being up for a big promotion, how busy she was with new responsibilities, but if she was home most afternoons. Well, I said, stepping back from the fence, I should let you get back to your flowers. They're beautiful, by the way. Thank you, dear. You're welcome to take some cuttings if you'd like. I always have more than I need. As I walked back to the house, I found myself thinking about abundance and scarcity. Mrs. Patterson had more flowers than she needed and offered to share. Sarah acted like every cookie I baked was somehow taking something away from her. When I got back, Sarah was in the kitchen, standing at the counter with her laptop open and her phone pressed to her ear. "No, that's not what we discussed," she was saying, her voice tight with frustration. The timeline was clearly stated in the contract. I tried to move quietly to the refrigerator for some water, but she held up one finger in a wait gesture. "Look, I don't care what your other priorities are. This project was supposed to be completed last week." A pause. "Well, maybe if you'd communicated the delays earlier, we could have adjusted expectations." I took my water and started to leave, but something in her tone made me glance back. She was gripping the phone so tightly, her knuckles were white. "Fine. But this goes in my report to management. Yes, I'll be documenting everything." She ended the call and immediately started typing on her laptop, her fingers hitting the keys harder than necessary. "Everything okay?" I asked. She looked up, startled. "Oh, yes, just work stuff. You know how it is." But I didn't know how. It was because in 40 years of marriage to a man who'd managed a construction crew, I'd never seen Harold come home and take his work frustrations out on the keyboard, or carry that level of tension in his shoulders at 8:30 in the morning. "Must be a demanding job," I said carefully. "It is." She closed the laptop with a snap. "Very demanding, especially when people don't do what they're supposed to do." The way she said it made me wonder if she was still talking about work. That afternoon, I walked a different route through the neighborhood. I wanted to get a sense of the area, maybe find a grocery store or a library within walking distance. Independence was going to be important if this arrangement was going to work long term. 3 blocks over, I found a small commercial strip, a dry cleaner, a pharmacy, a coffee shop called Grind Coffee with mismatched chairs on the sidewalk and the kind of handwritten menu that suggested the owners actually cared about what they served. And next to the coffee shop, a small storefront with a "for rent" sign in the window. I stood there for a long time, looking at that empty space. It wasn't large, maybe 600 square feet, but it had good natural light and what looked like the remnants of a commercial kitchen in the back. The kind of space where someone could, theoretically, run a small bakery. "You interested in the space?" I turned to find a woman about my age standing behind me, holding a steaming cup of coffee. "Just curious," I said. "I'm Janet. I own the coffee shop next door." She had gray hair cut in a sensible bob and the kind of smile that made you want to trust her immediately. "Been empty for about 6 months now. Last tenant was a sandwich shop that never quite caught on." "What's the rent like in this area?" "Oh, I couldn't say exactly, but Linda Morrison handles properties around here. Nice woman, fair from what I hear." She sipped her coffee and studied my face. "You thinking of starting something?" "Maybe. Someday." The words surprised me. I hadn't realized I was thinking of starting anything. "Well, if you do, you'll have at least one customer. I've been looking for someone who can supply decent pastries for months. Everything I get from the big distributors tastes like cardboard." As I walked home, I found myself calculating numbers in my head. Rent, utilities, supplies, permits. The kind of mental math I hadn't done in years, not since Harold and I had finally paid off the catering business and I'd transitioned into retirement. But retirement was looking different than I'd planned. And maybe that wasn't entirely a bad thing. When I got back to the house, David's car was in the driveway, unusual for a Wednesday afternoon. I found him in the living room, still in his work clothes, but with his tie loosened and his sleeves rolled up. He had papers spread across the coffee table and was staring at them like they might contain the secrets of the universe. "Hi, sweetheart," I said. "You're home early." He looked up, and I saw something in his eyes that reminded me of the scared Little boy who used to crawl into bed with Harold and me during thunderstorms. Mom, can I ask you something? I sat down in the chair across from him, noting how he'd automatically made room for me in the conversation space. Sarah never did that. Sarah arranged conversations like she arranged place settings with everyone in their designated spot. Of course, when you and Dad had the catering business, did you ever feel like you were in over your head? The question caught me off guard. David had been in high school when Harold and I were building the business. From his perspective, we'd probably looked like we knew exactly what we were doing. Every day, I said honestly, especially in the beginning, we'd get a big order and I'd lie awake at night wondering how we were going to pull it off. But you always did. Pull it off, I mean. Most of the time, we had our share of disasters too. Remember the Morrison wedding where I forgot to order the salmon? He smiled a little. You served chicken instead and told everyone it was a new Mediterranean recipe. And nobody knew the difference. Sometimes the disasters teach you more than the successes. He was quiet for a long moment, looking down at the papers again. I think I might be in over my head. Before I could respond, we heard Sarah's key in the front door. David immediately started gathering up the papers, shoving them back into a manila folder with movements that looked almost panicked. David? Sarah's voice carried from the entryway. Why is your car here? In the living room, he called back, but his voice had changed. Gone flat and careful. Sarah appeared in the doorway, taking in the scene with sharp eyes. Is everything all right? Fine, David said, standing up with the folder tucked under his arm. Just had some paperwork to catch up on. Okay. But her calm tone suggested it wasn't okay. Eleanor, how was your walk? Lovely. I'm starting to get a feel for the neighborhood. Good. Dinner's at 6:30 tonight. I'm trying a new recipe. She looked at David. Can you help me with something in the kitchen? It wasn't really a request. David followed her out of the room, and even though they kept their voices low, I could hear the urgent tone of their conversation. Not the words, just the rhythm. The back and forth of someone asking questions and someone else giving answers that didn't seem satisfactory. I stayed in the living room, looking at the spot where David had been sitting. Whatever was on those papers had scared him, and whatever was scaring him was something he felt he couldn't share with his wife. In my experience, when people start keeping secrets in a marriage, it's usually because they're afraid of the reaction they'll get if they tell the truth. And when you're afraid of your partner's reaction to the truth, you're not in a partnership anymore. You're in a hostage situation. As I sat there listening to the muffled conversation in the kitchen, I realized that this arrangement might be more complicated than just paying rent to live in my son's guest room. There were layers here, currents running beneath the surface that I was only beginning to understand. But I'd always been good at reading people. It was one of the skills that had made the catering business successful. You learn to watch body, language, to listen to what people don't say as much as what they do say. You learn to sense the dynamics in a room and adjust accordingly. And what I was sensing in this house was that everyone was afraid of something. Sarah was afraid of losing control. David was afraid of disappointing people. And I was afraid of becoming irrelevant. Maybe it was time for all of us to face our fears. Maybe it was time for me to stop being afraid of taking up space. The first order came from Mrs. Patterson, a dozen chocolate chip cookies for her book club. She paid me $25 and said they were the best cookies she'd tasted in 30 years. Word traveled fast in this neighborhood, apparently faster than Sarah's ability to control it. By the end of my second month in the house, I was getting requests 3 times a week. Nothing major, just neighbors wanting treats for small gatherings, parents needing something special for their kids' school events. I kept everything simple, working within my allocated 2 hours each morning, storing ingredients in containers. I'd labeled and tucked into the back corner of the pantry that Sarah never used. The extra income was modest but steady. More importantly, it gave me purpose. For the first time since Harold's funeral, I woke up excited about the day ahead. Sarah noticed, of course. She noticed everything. The electric bill was higher this month, she announced at dinner on a Tuesday evening in late September. She'd prepared some kind of quinoa salad that looked like bird food and tasted about the same. I'm wondering if all the extra baking might be contributing to that. David looked up from his plate, where he'd been pushing the quinoa around without much enthusiasm. Extra baking? Your mother's been using the oven quite a bit. Sarah's tone was carefully neutral, but I caught the edge underneath. I smell it every morning when I come downstairs. I'm happy to contribute more to utilities if that's a concern, I said, though I should mention that the oven was already on this morning when I came down to start breakfast. Sarah's fork paused halfway to her mouth. What do you mean? 6:15. This morning, the oven was still warm, like someone had been using it earlier. I took a sip of water, watching her face carefully. I assumed you'd been up early baking something yourself. The silence stretched uncomfortably. David looked confused, glancing between us like he was trying to follow a conversation in a foreign language. I don't bake, Sarah said finally. Oh. I kept my voice light, curious rather than accusatory. That's strange then. Maybe there's an electrical issue? Sometimes ovens can turn themselves on if there's a wiring problem. I'm sure that's not it. Sarah's voice had gone sharp. The house is only 8 years old. Still, might be worth having someone take a look. For safety reasons. I smiled pleasantly. I'd hate for there to be a fire or something. David was frowning now. Wait, Sarah, didn't you mention something? About getting up early to work on that big presentation? The look Sarah shot him could have frozen water. I said I was working on it, not that I was using the oven. But David was already putting pieces together, the way he used to solve word problems in middle school, working through each step methodically. But if you were stress baking again, like you did during the Johnson account crisis? I don't stress bake. The words came out like bullets. The chocolate croissants last month? When I found all those pastry boxes in the... David. Sarah's voice cut through his sentence like a blade. Could we not discuss my work habits in front of company? Company, not family, not even Eleanor. Company. The rest of dinner passed in strained silence. David excused himself early, mumbling something about work emails. Sarah cleared the table with sharp, efficient movements, declining my offer to help with the dishes. I retreated to my room, but the walls were thin enough that I could hear their voices from the master bedroom. Not the words, just the rhythm. Sarah's voice, rapid and intense. David's, shorter responses, defensive. The kind of conversation that ended with a door closing harder than necessary. Later that night, around 11:30, I heard footsteps in the kitchen. Quiet, deliberate movements. The soft whoosh of the oven door opening and closing. The timer being set for what sounded like 25 minutes. Stress baking at nearly midnight. I lay in the dark, thinking about what kind of stress would drive someone to bake chocolate croissants at midnight and then lie about it at dinner. The kind of stress that comes from losing control, maybe. The kind that comes from trying to hold too many balls in the air and feeling them start to slip. The next morning, the kitchen smelled like burnt sugar and disappointment. Sarah was already gone by the time I came down from my 6 a.m. shift. But she'd left evidence. Flour on the counter that hadn't been wiped properly. A mixing bowl in the dishwasher that still had chocolate residue. And in the trash can, carefully buried under coffee grounds and yesterday's newspaper, the remains of what looked like a dozen ruined pastries. I didn't mention it, but I started paying closer attention. 3 days later, I was coming back from my morning walk when I saw David's car in the driveway again. 2:30 in the afternoon, middle of the week. Through the living room window, I could see him sitting at his desk, head in his hands. When I came inside, he looked up with that same frightened expression I'd seen before. "Mom, can I ask you something else?" "Always." "How did you know when it was time to ask for help?" The question hit me like a physical blow. This was my child, my baby, asking for help in the most careful way possible. The way you ask when you're not sure help exists, or when you're afraid of what help might cost. "What kind of help, sweetheart?" He gestured vaguely at the papers spread across the desk. "Financial stuff, business stuff. I think I've made some mistakes." Before I could respond, we heard Sarah's car in the driveway. David immediately started shoving papers into folders. Again, that same panicked energy I'd seen before. "She doesn't know I'm home," he said quickly. "I told her I had meetings all afternoon." "Why?" "Because she'll want to know why I left work early, and I can't tell her that." He stood up, folders clutched against his chest. "Can we talk later, after she goes to bed?" I nodded, but my heart was breaking. My son was hiding in his own home, afraid to have a conversation with his wife about whatever was troubling him. Sarah came through the front door like a woman on a mission, all sharp heels and sharper energy. She stopped short when she saw me in the living room. "Oh, hi. I thought you'd be out on your walk." "Just got back. Beautiful day." She was already moving toward the stairs, but something made her pause. "Have you seen David today?" The question felt loaded, like there was a right answer and a wrong answer, and I wasn't sure which was which. "Not since this morning," I said truthfully. She nodded, but her eyes were scanning the living room, taking inventory. Looking for, evidence of something. "I'll be working from home the rest of the afternoon," she said. "I have some important calls to make." As soon as she disappeared upstairs, I heard David's car start in the garage. He was sneaking out of his own house like a teenager avoiding a curfew. That evening at dinner, Sarah was particularly chatty. Too chatty the way people get when they're overcompensating for something. I had the most interesting conversation. "With my supervisor today," she said, cutting her grilled chicken into precise uniform pieces. "Looks like that promotion might come through sooner than expected." "That's wonderful," I said, watching David's face. He was nodding along, but something in his expression didn't match his wife's enthusiasm. It would mean more money, obviously. And more responsibilities. I might have to travel more, maybe work some longer hours. She looked directly at me. "It would definitely help with household expenses." Household expenses, like my rent. "When would this start?" David asked. "Soon, very soon. My supervisor said they're fast-tracking the decision." Sarah took a sip of wine, and I noticed her hand was trembling slightly. "Of course, nothing's definite yet, but it looks very promising." After dinner, I offered to help with dishes again. This time, Sarah accepted, which surprised me. "Eleanor," she said as we worked side by side at the sink, "I want you to know that I appreciate how adaptable you've been about this living arrangement." Adaptable, another weapon word. "I'm grateful to have a place to stay," I said. "Good, because I think it's working out well for everyone." She handed me a plate to dry. "David seems less stressed lately, more focused." I almost laughed. David seemed like a man hanging on by his fingernails. But apparently, we were seeing different versions of my son. "Sarah, can I ask you something?" She tensed slightly. "Of course." "Are you happy?" The question clearly caught her off guard. She stopped washing the glass in her hands and looked at me directly for the first time in weeks. "Happy? In your marriage? In your life? Are you happy?" For just a moment, her carefully constructed mask slipped. I saw something raw and vulnerable underneath, something that looked like desperation. "I'm working toward happiness," she said finally. "Sometimes you have to sacrifice short-term comfort for long-term security." "And David? Is he working toward Happiness too? The mask snapped back into place. David is fine. We're fine. Everything is fine. But nothing was fine, and we both knew it. That night, David knocked softly on my door around 11 o'clock. "Is now a good time for that talk?" he whispered. We went down to the kitchen, speaking in hushed tones like conspirators. He made tea while I pulled out some leftover cookies from my morning's batch. "Mom, I think I'm in trouble." His hands were shaking as he stirred sugar into his cup. "Real trouble." "What kind of trouble?" "Financial. There was this investment opportunity at work. A sure thing, they called it. A way to make quick money to..." He trailed off, staring into his tea. "To what?" "To catch up. We've been behind on things for months. The mortgage, credit cards, car payments. Sarah's been covering it somehow, but I could see the stress was killing her. When this investment thing came up, it seemed like the answer." My stomach dropped. "How much?" $15,000. Our entire emergency fund plus some money I borrowed against my 401k. He looked up at me with eyes full of shame. "It's gone, Mom. All of it. The company was a scam, and now I owe money I don't have to people who are starting to ask questions." I felt like I was watching my child drown. "Does Sarah know?" "God, no. She'd leave me. She's already been talking about how disappointed she is in my career trajectory, how we're not where we should be at this stage of our lives. If she knew I'd lost our safety net chasing some get-rich-quick scheme..." He buried his face in his hands. "I can't tell her, but I don't know how to fix it either." "David, honey, look at me." He raised his head, and I saw the little boy who used to come to me with scraped knees and broken toys, believing I could fix anything. "First, you're not alone in this. Second, we're going to figure it out. And third, you need to stop carrying this by yourself. It's eating you alive." "But Sarah is your wife. She married you for better or worse, remember? This qualifies as worse, but that doesn't mean it's the end of the world." "You don't understand. She's been the one holding everything together financially. Her job, her organization, her planning. I was supposed to be contributing equally, and instead, I've made everything worse." Something clicked into place. "David, where exactly does Sarah work?" "Morrison Marketing, downtown. She's a senior account manager, up for promotion to director." Morrison Marketing. I knew that name from somewhere. It took me a moment to place it, but then I remembered. Linda Morrison, the real estate agent Janet had mentioned, the one who handled properties in the neighborhood. "How long has she been up for this promotion?" "About 6 months, maybe longer. It's been a long process." 6 months. The same amount of time that storefront had been empty. The same period when Mrs. Patterson said Sarah had been working from home more often. "David, I want you to do something for me. Tomorrow, I want you to call Morrison Marketing and ask to speak with Sarah Henderson." His brow furrowed. "Why?" "Just do it. From your office, during business hours. Say you're her husband, and you need to reach her about something urgent." "Mom, I don't understand." "Trust me. Call her at Morrison Marketing tomorrow, and then we'll talk tomorrow night." He looked confused but nodded. After he went back upstairs, I sat in the dark kitchen for a long time, thinking about stress baking at midnight and promotions that never quite materialized, and bills hidden in drawers. Thinking about lies that were getting too big to hide. The next evening, David's face told me everything I needed to know before he said a word. "She doesn't work there," he said simply. "Hasn't worked there for 3 months. They said she was let go for performance issues." We sat in silence, absorbing the implications. "The money she's been using to cover our bills," I started. "I don't know where it's coming from." His voice was barely a whisper. "I don't know anything anymore." That's when I told him about the midnight baking, The bills in the drawer, the conversation with Mrs. Patterson about expensive suits and working from home. I told him about the oven being warm in the mornings and the ruined pastries in the trash. She's been lying to both of us, I said gently. The question is why? David was quiet for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was different, older somehow. What do? We find out the truth, all of it, and then we figure out how to move forward. Together? I reached across the table and took his hand. Together. But even as I said it, I was thinking about that empty storefront 3 blocks away, about Janet's comment regarding needing a pastry supplier, about the modest but growing income from my cookie orders and what it might become if I had a real kitchen and regular hours. I was thinking about independence, not just for David, but for myself. Because sometimes the best way to help someone you love is to show them that survival is possible, that you can rebuild from nothing, that 68 is not too old for a fresh start. Outside, I could hear Sarah moving around upstairs, her heels clicking against the hardwood floor with the precise rhythm of someone who still believed she was in control. But control, I was learning, was mostly an illusion. The only thing you could really control was how you responded when everything else fell apart. And I was just getting started with my response. The next morning, I walked past the empty storefront again. This time I stopped and wrote down the phone number on the rental sign. When I got home, I called Linda Morrison. I'd like to know more about the space next to Grind Coffee, I told her. Are you thinking of starting a business? She asked. I'm thinking of starting over, I said. And for the first time in months, that felt like the same thing. The storefront rental was $1,200 a month. Linda Morrison walked me through the space on a crisp October morning, pointing out the updated electrical system and the small kitchen area in the back that just needed some minor equipment to be fully functional. Previous tenant left some of the basic infrastructure, she explained, opening cabinets to reveal commercial-grade shelving. The health department permits are still current for food service, which could save you months of paperwork. I nodded, calculating quickly in my head. My cookie business was bringing in about $800 a month now, growing every week. With a real kitchen and proper hours, I could easily triple that, maybe more. I'd like to put in an application, I said. Linda smiled. I'll need first month's rent, security deposit, and references, plus income verification, of course. Income verification. That was going to be interesting to explain. Can I ask you something, Linda? Do you know Sarah Henderson? She mentioned once that she worked with a Morrison in marketing. Linda's expression shifted slightly. I think you might be thinking of Morrison Marketing downtown, different Morrison entirely, though. She paused, seeming to consider her words carefully. I do know Sarah Henderson. She actually inquired about this same space about 4 months ago. My heart stopped. She did? Came in with all sorts of plans for a high-end boutique, designer clothes, accessories, that sort of thing. Very ambitious. Linda locked the door behind us as we stepped back onto the sidewalk. But when it came time for the financial documentation, she couldn't provide what we needed. Shame, really. She seemed quite passionate about the idea. 4 months ago, right around the time she would have been fired from Morrison Marketing, that evening, I made David his favorite dinner. Meatloaf with mashed potatoes and green beans, the same meal I'd cooked for his birthday every year since he turned 7. Sarah was working late again, or at least that's what she'd told us in the hurried text message she'd sent around 5 o'clock. David, I said as we finished eating, I need to tell you something, and then I need to ask you for a favor. He looked up from his plate, wary. What kind of favor? The kind that might save both our lives. I told him about the storefront, about my conversation with Linda Morrison, about Sarah's failed attempt to rent the same space. I told him about my plan to expand the baking business, to create something that could sustain us both if everything else fell apart. But I need a co-signer for the lease, I finished. Someone with verifiable employment and credit history. Mom, I can't. If Sarah found out, Sarah is going to find out anyway. About the money you lost, about her job, about whatever else she's been hiding. The question is whether we're going to be prepared when that happens, or whether we're going to be caught with nothing. He was quiet for a long time, pushing the key, last bits of meatloaf around his plate. What if you're wrong? What if there's some explanation for all this? Then we'll deal with that too. But David, I've been watching people lie for 68 years. I know what it looks like. And right now we're living in a house built on lies. That's when we heard Sarah's key in the front door. Earlier than expected, her heels clicking against the hardwood with the sharp staccato rhythm that usually meant trouble. David, she called out, we need to talk. David. And I exchanged a look. He rose from the table like a man walking to his execution. Sarah was standing in the living room, still in her coat, her purse clutched in both hands like a shield. Her face was pale, and I could see the muscles in her, jaw working. I got a call today, she said without preamble. From your office. Someone asking about an emergency contact form that needed updating. David went very still. Okay. They mentioned that they'd tried to reach me at Morrison Marketing first. Said they wanted to verify my employment information. The 5-year silence in the room was deafening. I could hear the grandfather clock ticking in the hallway, counting down the seconds until the truth exploded. Sarah, David started. Don't. Her voice was sharp enough to cut glass. Don't you dare lie to me, not after everything I've done to hold this family together. Everything you've done? The words came out of David with surprising force. What exactly have you done, Sarah? Besides lie about where you work and stress bake at midnight and hide bills in kitchen drawers? Sarah's face went from pale to red. How dare you? No, how dare you? David was standing now, and I saw something in him I hadn't seen since. He was a teenager standing up to bullies at school. I know you got fired 3 months ago. I know you've been pretending to work somewhere you don't work. I know about the bills and the late notices and whatever money you've been using to cover our expenses that you haven't told me about. You don't know anything. Then tell me. The words exploded out of him. Tell me where the money's been coming from. Tell me how we're affording this house and your car payments and the credit card bills. Tell me the truth about something, anything. Sarah looked between David and me, her eyes wild. This is her fault, she said, pointing at me. She's been poisoning you against me since the day she moved in here. I haven't said a word against you, I said quietly. You haven't had to. You've been playing the perfect grandmother, baking cookies and taking walks and making friends with the neighbors, making me look like the bad guy for charging you rent. You are charging me rent, I pointed out, because we need the money. The words burst out of her like water through a broken dam. Because your son lost $15,000 of our savings on some idiotic investment scheme, and I've been scrambling for months to keep us from losing the house. David's face went white. How did you... Credit monitoring, David. I get alerts every time there's activity on our accounts. Did you really think you could borrow against your 401k without me finding out? They stood there staring at each other, both breathing hard, both looking like they'd been hit by a truck. So you've both been lying, I said calmly. They turned to look at me, united for the first time in months by their shared shock at my bluntness. David lost money he was afraid to tell you about. Sarah lost her job she was afraid to tell you about. And instead of facing the problem together, you've both been running separate cons to avoid dealing with the truth. It's not that simple, Sarah started. It's exactly that simple. I stood, up, moving to the center of the room so I could see both of them clearly. You're both so busy protecting each other from the truth that you're destroying yourselves and your marriage." "You don't understand," Sarah said, but her voice had lost its edge. Now she just sounded tired. "I've been working 3 different gig jobs to keep us afloat. Food delivery, online tutoring, freelance social media management, working 18-hour days and pretending everything was fine because I couldn't bear to tell David that I'd failed. And I couldn't tell you I'd made everything worse," David said quietly. "You were already carrying so much, and I thought if I could fix it quietly. By gambling our emergency fund?" "It wasn't gambling. It was supposed to be a sure thing. Other people at work had made money, and I thought..." He sank back into his chair. "I thought I could be the hero for once instead of the screw-up. I looked at these 2 people I loved, both drowning in their own shame and fear, and I made a decision. 'I'm buying a house,' I said. They stared at me. 'I found a little place 4 blocks from here. 2 bedrooms, 1 bath, needs some work, but it's structurally sound. The owner is motivated to sell quickly.'" "Mom, what are you talking about?" David asked. "I'm talking about independence, yours and mine." I sat back down, folding my hands in my lap. "I'm also renting a commercial space, going to expand the baking business into something real." "With what money?" Sarah asked. Her tone wasn't hostile anymore, just confused. "That's the interesting part." I smiled, feeling lighter than I had in months. "Turns out your father was more of a financial planner than I gave him credit for." I told them about the envelope I'd found while packing up Harold's papers. The investment account I didn't know existed, set up 30 years ago with automatic contributions from his paycheck. The account that had been quietly growing for 3 decades while I worried about our retirement savings. "How much?" David whispered. "Enough to buy the house outright, enough to set up the bakery, enough to help you get back on your feet if you want the help." Sarah was crying now, silent tears streaming down her face. "I don't understand. Why would you help us after everything we've put you through?" "Because you're family. Because everyone deserves a second chance. And because, frankly, I'm tired of pretending that paying $3,700 to sleep in my own son's guest room is a reasonable arrangement." David laughed, a sound somewhere between relief and hysteria. "God, when you put it like that." "It was a ridiculous amount," Sarah admitted. "I was just so scared and angry, and I wanted to punish someone for everything falling apart." "Well, mission accomplished," I said dryly. "But now, we move forward." 3 weeks later, I stood in my new kitchen, looking out the window at the small garden behind my house. The morning sun was streaming through the glass, highlighting the dust motes dancing in the air. In 2 hours, I was opening Eleanor's kitchen for the first time, with a line of customers already forming outside thanks to word-of-mouth advertising and a feature article in the local paper. David knocked on the back door, balancing 2 cups of coffee and a concerned expression. "How are you feeling?" he asked, handing me one of the cups. "Terrified, excited, like I'm 25 and starting over." I took a sip of the coffee, perfect as always. "How are things at home?" "Better. Different, but better." He leaned against the counter, looking more relaxed than I'd seen him in months. "Sarah started seeing a therapist about the shopping and the lies. We're doing couples counseling too." "And the money situation?" "Getting better. She got a real job again, entry level, but it's honest work. And I've been working overtime to pay back the 401k loan." He smiled ruefully. "Turns out facing your problems head on is less exhausting than running from them." Imagine that. We stood in comfortable silence for a few minutes, watching the morning come alive through the window. "Mom," David said finally, "I owe you an apology." "For what?" "For letting it get that bad. for not standing up for you when Sarah suggested the rent thing, for being so wrapped up in my own fear that I forgot you were grieving too. I set down my coffee cup and turned to face him fully. David, listen to me. You don't owe me an apology for being human, for making mistakes, for not knowing how to handle an impossible situation. But nothing. We're all just figuring it out as we go along. The only difference is, some people admit it and some people pretend they have all the answers. Which kind of person do you think I am? I smiled, seeing so much of Harold in his face, so much of the little boy who used to help me make cookies on Saturday mornings. I think you're the kind of person who asks that question, which means you're going to be just fine. At exactly 9 o'clock, I unlocked the front door of Eleanor's kitchen. Mrs. Patterson was first in line, followed by Janet from the coffee shop next door, followed by a dozen other neighbors I'd come to know during my morning walks. "What's good today?" Mrs. Patterson asked, studying the display case I'd filled with fresh muffins, cookies, and pastries. "Everything," I said, and meant it. By noon, I'd sold out of nearly everything. By 3 o'clock, I had orders for the next week. By closing time, I was exhausted, flour-covered, and happier than I'd been since before Harold got sick. Sarah stopped by just as I was finishing the cleanup, carrying a small wrapped package. "Peace offering," she said, looking nervous. Inside the package was a small framed photo, Sarah and David on their wedding day, with Harold and me standing beside them. We all looked so young, so hopeful, so sure that love would be enough to carry us through anything. "I wanted to apologize," Sarah said. "Not just for the rent thing, but for everything. For making you feel unwelcome in your own son's home. For taking my fear and anger out on you when you were just trying to find your place after losing Harold." "We all did what we thought we had to do," I said, propping the photo on the counter where I could see it while I worked. "The important thing is we figured out a better way." "Is it?" "Better, I mean." I looked around my small kitchen, at the evidence of a successful first day, at the order forms for tomorrow already filled out and waiting. I thought about my house 4 blocks away, about the garden I was planning to plant in the spring, about the cooking classes I wanted to offer and the community cookbook project I'd been discussing with Janet. "Much better," I said. 6 months later, Eleanor's kitchen had become the heart of the neighborhood. I was employing 2 part-time helpers and had a waiting list for my Saturday morning cooking classes. David and Sarah had bought their own small house closer to David's work, a place they could actually afford, and they stopped by every Sunday for dinner. Sarah had turned out to be surprisingly good at marketing, helping me set up a website and social media presence for the business. She understood the digital world in ways I never would, and I understood the importance of personal connections in ways she was just learning. We made a good team, it turned out. Better as business partners than we'd ever been as forced housemates. 1. Sunday evening, as we were cleaning up after dinner, Sarah asked me something that had been on her mind. "Eleanor, do you think you would have started the bakery if Harold hadn't died? If the whole rent situation had never happened?" I considered the question seriously. "I don't know, maybe not. I was pretty comfortable in retirement, pretty settled in my routines." "So, in a weird way, we did you a favor?" I laughed. "Let's not go that far. But I will say this, sometimes, the worst thing that happens to you turns out to be the thing that pushes you toward the best thing that could happen to you. Even when you're 68? Especially when you're 68. At my age, you don't have time to waste on being polite about the life you don't want." As they were leaving that night, David hugged me at the door. "I'm proud of you, Mom," he said, "for everything you built, for how you handled all of us falling apart." "I didn't handle anything, sweetheart. I just decided to stop pretending that other people's fear was more important than my own dreams." After they left, I sat in my garden with a cup of tea, watching the sun set over the neighborhood I'd come to love. In the distance, I could hear children playing, neighbors calling to each other across yard fences, the ordinary sounds of people living their lives. It had been 18 months since Sarah had demanded $3,700 for the privilege of sleeping in their guest room. 18 months since I'd felt like a burden, like someone whose usefulness had expired. Now I employed people. I fed people. I taught people family recipes and listened to their stories and helped them celebrate birthdays and mourn losses and mark all the small moments that make up a life. I'd learned something important during those months of upheaval. The opposite of being a burden isn't being useful. The opposite of being a burden is being free. Free to make choices based on your own values instead of other people's expectations. Free to take up space without apologizing for it. Free to start over as many times as you need to until you get it right. The garden was coming along nicely. I'd planted herbs and vegetables, flowers and fruit trees. Some things were already producing, others wouldn't bear fruit for years. But that was okay. I had time. At 68, I'd discovered that beginnings don't have expiration dates, and I was just getting started.